introduce our first guest. I want to thank our friends at Smith Publicity, our good friends Christy, who were basically able to make this happen. I'm really excited. I can't tell you. I'm a little nervous too. I'm gonna bring on Joelle Castix. Joelle, how you doing?
Well, I was great until you reminded me it's almost tax time. Now I'm depressed.
Oh my goodness! I want to thank you for joining us. I was watching you on TED Talks. I don't know. I was taken aback a little bit because I was like, boy, I really have a big star coming on here tonight.
Oh, now I feel better. Thank you.
Oh my goodness! So I received the advance copy earlier. I tweeted it out to you, a picture of it. I want to thank you and the PR team for always making things happen. I have yet to start to read it, but I did initially skim through it. Joelle, I'm just going to decrease. I want you to tell your story, bring awareness to a few things, and I guess we'll go from there because I have a couple of questions, and I know it's a subject that's near and dear to you. So I'm going to stop talking. Let the world know who you are.
Okay. Well, first, thank you so much for having me on the show. Anytime I can talk to parents is so valuable because I think that that's how we're going to change the world. I grew up in Southern California, and where I still live, and I am a survivor of child sexual abuse. I was sexually abused at my high school, which is a very prestigious Catholic high school here in Southern California. And I was targeted by my choir teacher because I was vulnerable. I came from an alcoholic home. My father was in big denial and just trying to keep his family together. And so as the younger daughter, I just fell through the cracks. And I was looking for adult mentorship. I was looking for an adult who would listen to my problems and who would help me. But unfortunately, I was targeted by a predator who used attention and manipulation and flattery to blur sexual boundaries and began sexually abusing me. And so the abuse lasted for 2 years until I was 17. And when I graduated from high school, I was pregnant and had a sexually transmitted disease. And I was alone. And because predators are cunning, they work very hard to separate you and isolate you from your peers. So when my peers began to become suspicious and they realized something was going on, my predator threatened them and said, "You better not say anything or you're going to get in trouble." When I went to a school official and said, "Hey, something weird is going on," she told me, because she had already talked to my predator, that this is what love was. And if I said anything, that I would get in trouble. Oh yeah, and there's a huge cover-up scandal at my high school. It was terrible. That involved dozens of kids, and I was isolated from my parents already, and so I was horribly sexually abused. I was all alone, and I had no one to go to, and so that's what keeps kids from reporting. That's what keeps kids from coming forward, because now all of a sudden I'm convinced that it's all my fault, that I must have done something to ask for it, that I'm this horrible, bad, and shameful person. And so I lived in this isolation and shame and self-destructive behavior for years. And, and then as many victims of child sexual abuse do, we grow up, your psychosexual development stops the day the abuse starts. And so you don't learn coping skills. You don't learn how to interact properly with other people. You don't understand what boundaries are. You don't understand how to have relationships because you didn't learn to do it with your peers. An adult forced it on you. And so, I somehow clawed my way through college and ended up getting married and divorced in a horrible relationship. And it wasn't until my late 20s that I realized that if I continued on the path I was on, I was going to die. There was just no way that I was going to be able to survive this, because I was so depressed and so self-destructive and so full of shame. And And maybe it was a combination of spite or whatever, or just the desire to actually say, hey, maybe there's a better option here. I decided, you know what, I have a choice. I can live or I can die. I can change and make my life better, or I can stay on this track and, nosedive. And so I decided to change my life, and I took responsibility. And it's not, I didn't take blame for the abuse because it wasn't my fault, but I took responsibility for how I was living my life then. And so when I was a few years later, and when I was 33, I was able to, in California, we had a civil window. You're in New York. There's a huge movement to have a civil window for child sex abuse victims going on right now in New York. And these things are amazing because it allows older victims to come forward and use the civil courts, meet the burden of proof and all this stuff, to expose their abuser. And when I was abused, the law at the time said that I had to come forward when I was 19. If I didn't do by the time I was 19, that was it. So if I was 19 and 1 day old and he was abusing other people, there was nothing I could do about it to expose what happened to me. So this 1 year window opened. I was 32 and I filed, I finally decided, I'm going to file a lawsuit, and I did. And there was about 2 years of litigation that went on. And throughout the litigation, the man who sexually abused me went out to the media and said that I was lying and that it didn't happen and that I was emotionally disturbed and all this stuff. And by this time, I'm a working professional, so it was not a big career builder for me. But when the litigation ended 2 years later, I was one of 97 kids who had come forward in Orange County, California. 30 of us were from my high school. That's how bad it was. And I got 200 pages of documents in my case. And in it was a signed confession from my perpetrator saying that he had sexually abused me and other girls. There was paperwork from administrators who said, oh, yeah, they knew about it, but they really, they didn't think it was that big a deal. And then there was paperwork from the Diocese of Orange, who owned and ran the school, saying that, they didn't think it was that big a deal because I was emotionally disturbed. And it was astounding to see these documents, because talk about huge vindication. Because when people tell, they spent 15 years telling me that it was all my fault and that I was a liar. And here are all these documents that show how adults in positions of power over kids are blaming children for their own abuse, are saying that children deserve it because they have emotional problems, and are allowing predators to sign signed confessions and quietly go away and get other jobs without calling the cops. And after that, I did receive a financial settlement, and that was a big decision time in my life. And, and I became a big whistleblower and a big advocate, and I still am, for victims of clergy sexual abuse. And when you're a whistleblower and are public in the paper and on TV, you're not really high on the corporation's list of potential hires. So I really had to rethink my career. And so I decided that I was going to devote myself to exposing abuse and helping victims and, getting the word out there. And then I had a son. And when he was born, my husband and I were given all these books, how to change diapers and how to teach your kids sign language and how to do this and how to do that. And there was nothing about protecting your child against child sexual abuse.
Right.
And it didn't really strike me that much until I started talking to other parents who, when they found out what I did, would look at me with this deer in the headlights thing, saying, Joelle, what do I do? How do I protect my kid? I never want to let him out of my sight. And my answer was always, it's so easy. I've been all over the world helping survivors. I've been to the villages of Western Alaska above the Arctic Circle. I've been to Guam. I've been to Europe. I've been to Mexico. I've been to, the East Coast helping survivors. And all of our stories are the same. Right. And all of our abuse could have been prevented if our parents and community members just had some simple tools to identify grooming, to understand how to empower kids, and to make sure, and to learn how to report. And so that's why I wrote the book. And it was interesting. I tried to get mainstream publishing interested. I had a ton of support from a couple of Pulitzer Prize-winning authors who were like, this is great, so on and so forth. They helped me try to pitch it. No one was interested. And so I said, well, you know what? This book is too important. And so It's hybrid published, which means I have a mainstream publisher, but it doesn't get the exposure I would like it to. But that's why I've hustled so much, because everywhere I go, people want this book, and it's evergreen. It will last. The information in this book will last forever. And if writing this book will save one kid from abuse, it's totally worth it.
Totally. I want to thank you for sharing your story with us, with our listeners. I'm at a loss for words right now. My one question that I initially had for you is, why is talking about child abuse still considered taboo?
We don't like to talk about things that are abhorrent. Child sexual abuse is abhorrent. For 99.9999% of the population, the idea of sexually abusing a child is sickening. And so we don't want to talk about it. We don't want to acknowledge that it exists. And then on the other side, we have older religious views, and many, many churches are changing and they're advocating very differently now, which is important, but they put shame on sexuality. And right. So, like in my generation, so I was a kid in the 70s and 80s. I'm 45. I had to do the math there for a second. And so, when I was a kid going to Catholic school.
Joelle, I have to jump in. I'm 45 also, so don't feel bad.
Okay, good. So you totally understand me. Okay, so I went to Catholic. Yeah, I went to Catholic school in the 70s and 80s, and if I said, like, you could say head, shoulders, knees, toes, liver, kidney, bile ducts, whatever, but if you said the word vagina in school, you got in trouble. Right. And even if you were talking about it in a biological way. And so what this does is puts a shame on kids, and even adults wouldn't talk about it. And so they lived in this fantasy world. And we were so quick to blame children or to think that they must have done something to ask for it. And it was also so morally abhorrent, it was just easier not to talk about it. We lived in this beautiful denial, but it was an ugly denial. And there's a whole generation of children who grew into adults who lived in this shame and silence. And many still do today, even though we're much more open about it. But the reason we talk about it more is because I think survivors like myself just got sick and tired of sitting in the shadows. Because as we grew in awareness and as, we understood that crimes against children are never a child's fault, all of a sudden victims became empowered to tell their stories. And we owe a lot to the early people who came forward in the clergy sex abuse crisis, because they're the people who really started the conversation. And that now has really changed. And now, when I talk to younger mothers, they're a lot like I am. They say, it was kind of weird for me to talk about my body that way. But for our kids, my son knows all the biological parts of his body. And he knows exactly, not exactly what all of them do. He's not quite to that point of understanding sexuality, but he knows that no one touches it, no one goes near it, no one plays with it, no one spends attention on it, no one takes pictures of it, none of that. Whereas, back in the day, if a predator sat down next to a child and put his hand on her knee or her hand on his knee and said, "Hey, how are you? Ooh, oh, you're so soft," the kid would be like, "Oh, thank you." Now, right. My son would be like, "I'm sorry, my penis is right close to there. I don't feel comfortable." He would just say it. And that's because that's how he's been taught. And it puts predators on notice. So I think our kids today are so much more empowered than what they ever were before.
I have to ask you, Joelle, give us the top signs and symptoms of abuse so that parents should know, or things that, of course, it's going to be listed within the Well-Armored Child, but if you can give us,
Well, first you really want to think about the signs of predatory grooming. And predatory grooming is how a child sex offender finds victims and makes them compliant. And that means that, I'm not saying it's a willing victim, It's a victim who is so confused and manipulated that they don't know how to fight back, and they just kind of sit there and take it. So once you understand the signs of grooming, things like an adult is spending inappropriate amounts of time with your child and giving your child way too much attention, more attention than that adult gives other children. If there's a lot of flattery, if an adult is giving your child gifts, especially gifts that are being hidden from you, we're talking about technology, cell phones, prepaid credit cards, anything that is out, especially out of your price range, expensive sports gear, things like that, and gives it to your child without asking you first. You want to look out for that. You want to look out for secrets. You know, an adult is sharing secrets with your child, because sometimes maybe those gifts that you don't know about could include things like pornography, alcohol, and drugs, and it creates this world of secrecy. You want to make sure your child's not being isolated from you or his peers by another adult or an older child. And you start to see these things, and you're like, oh, once you start to understand the signs of grooming, then you can really intervene. Because once the child is, you know, isolated from friends and family and has all these gifts he can't talk about, and there's all these secrets, and the only person who makes him feel nice is his predator, then the predator can blur sexual boundaries by things like talking about sex, touching, holding, hugging, kissing, and full-blown abuse. So you start by knowing those things. And, you know, you may miss them because predators are cunning. But so you have to really know your child and open up communication with your kid. So if a child is being sexually abused, you want to see changes in their behavior. Because when you look at the symptoms of a kid who's being sexually abused, it's also the symptoms of a kid who's involved in a drug or alcohol problem. Secrecy, self-destructive behaviors, cutting, you know, hurting themselves, drug and alcohol abuse, isolation, anger, frustration, failing out of school, quitting activities that they used to love, not seeing their friends anymore that they used to like, things like that. And it can be very subtle changes, but changes that make you say, what happened to my happy child?
Right.
What happened to my sweet child? You also want to see if there are changes in your child, if your child shows sexualized behavior that's inappropriate. If your child talks about things that you have never expressed to your child. So, for an example, I've worked with a family. She had a 5-year-old. The 5-year-old was being watched during the day by her grandfather. Grandfather began sexually abusing the child. And so the little girl would start to say things about grandpa taking her to the bathroom. Now, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, my parents just would have dismissed that. Oh, yeah, grandpa's fine, so on and so forth. But mom stopped and listened and started asking questions, because younger children will want to tell you, because they don't, when they're confused, mom and dad are their safe haven. And so they'll want to talk. And so you give them the opportunity to speak out in their own way and not put language into their mouth, but just ask them little questions, and they may start telling you things. So you want to look for changes in behavior, changes in language, and any kind of emotional distress. And that will be accompanied by spending time with an adult who, you know, you are not supervising, you know, and the other things that go along with predatory grooming.
Joelle, there's so many questions that I have to ask. We're running out of time. I wanted to, I guess I'll stop here, and I really want you to talk about ways to get in contact with you. I want you to talk about your blog, The Worthy Adversary. I want you to talk about your book. That's ways to purchase it, and social media handles and the like. What are the best ways to get in contact with you and find your work?
Well, I'm a scourge on the internet. Yeah, so I have a website. My website is caspex.com, and that's the spelling of my last name, which is kind of tough. So it's C as in cat, A, S as in Sam, T as in Tom, E, I, X as in X-ray. And on that website, you can sign up for my newsletter. And my newsletter isn't just like, oh, a day in the life of Joelle. I give away all kinds of stuff. I'm always giving away free books. I have a free book giveaway coming up later this month on how to talk to adult survivors of sexual abuse. I also do a lot of work with writers trying to tell their stories. And when I have my books at reduced rates, and I always have access to resources. And all my books are listed there. You can also go on to Amazon or Barnes & Noble or Kobo or your favorite online retail store, and most of my books are up there. Amazon has the biggest catalog. And if you looked up Well Armored Child or Joelle Castex, you'll find it there. My blog is The Worthy Adversary, and that's my website tends to be a little more parent-focused and focused on my books. The Worthy Adversary deals with breaking news as it happens when it comes to child sexual abuse, mostly in institutional organizations. Because when I'm not doing parent advocacy, I'm an expert when it comes to cover-up documents. So I'm always the person going through the documents and finding all this stuff and talking to survivors and demanding accountability. I also do a lot of freelance writing for parenting magazines and local publications, and you'll find that stuff on my blog too. And that's theworthyadversary.com. And all these websites are linked. So if you end up on one, you can always click to another. And they all link to my TEDx talk, and they all link to the books. And, The Worthy Adversary, if you really want to get riled up and not sleep, read it late at night. and then you can always get access to all my books through both sites. Oh, and then social media, I'm on Facebook and Twitter. I'm on Facebook and Twitter. I'm trying to grow my Instagram thing, but there's only so many hours in the day. But you can find me on all of those. I have a public like page that it's Joelle Castex, author of The Well Armored Child, and I post all kinds of stuff there too.
One thing you left out, tell us really quickly about SNAP.
SNAP is a great organization. It's a survivors network of those abused by priests, and they are the nation's largest support group for men and women sexually abused in religious and institutional organizations. And they started 25 years ago as a bunch of clergy sex abuse victims who, before the internet, you just thought you were the only one, and you couldn't track guys as they were moved around. And if you had letters from one bishop, you couldn't share them with someone who had letters from another bishop. And so they started as a support group and advocacy organization. And when I joined in 2002, we had really gotten into the internet side of things, and they began to expand because, I was not abused by a priest. I was abused by a lay teacher who was covered up by the system. But we have expanded tremendously. I'm a volunteer with them. None of us are paid except for the executive director. And so, we have a Baptist chapter and a Mormon chapter and an Adventist chapter and a boarding school chapter and a private school chapter for people who just want to talk to someone who's been through the same thing they have. And it's a great organization run on a shoestring budget. And basically what we do is we raise awareness to the problem, and we tell people that it's safe to come forward and get help. And their website is snapnetwork.org.
Perfect.
Oh, and if you've seen the Spotlight movie, SNAP plays a huge role in that movie.
Really? Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks so much. Joelle, I want to give you a round of applause. Thank you so much for coming on. Spending, I'm really grateful for you spending 20, 25 minutes with us. You didn't have to. You could have said, you know what, Ted, we could do this interview via email, and that's that. Thanks so much.
Vacunarte es tu llave de